Bonjour.
Good afternoon. I have a very important duty, which is to present you the Silk Road. The Silk Road has been around for years and years, but we'll try to narrow it down. We'll try to narrow it down to SILKROAD.com, which is a startup that was begun 8 years ago and developed a number of tools to help management and HR. Its founders had an experience with creating businesses linked to business prototype. Here they've really created a product. They have a board which provides them with financial and other relations and enables them to develop their applications. Today, SILKROAD Point has a turnover of 5 million euros. There's 400 employees, which is a good number after 8 years, and they've experienced an international development starting in Asia. Contrary to other businesses that start in Europe, they are American. They started out in Asia. They could have looked either way, and now they're starting out in Europe. They have a few thousand clients, which tend to be SMEs, as well as a few large Fortune 100 companies and very small businesses that use some of their products because they're adequate for what they do. After 8 years of practice, SILKROAD.com can be said to have had a very good start. It's now trying to go that little bit further. And it's original in that it really focused on talent management, bringing new talent to businesses and managing talent. This approach was based on the idea of mixing new technology with HR experience. What they wanted to do was to build a partnership with their customers, who were businesses, to try to suggest to them using those talent management tools. On this basis, they've developed a few tools with names such as Red Carpet, Green Light, so you can get an idea of what they're about just from the name. And the one we're going to talk about today is called Point. Point works on the idea of digital leaders. Leadership goes through people, and are digital leaders the same people as the ones who are leaders in the business hierarchy? So this is an internal system that tries to find who those digital leaders are. What we're trying to do here is to get back to basics once again, really try to find who the leaders are and catalyze all this energy. This is about measuring influence, how leaders can be identified, and there are other questions this brings to the fore. Issues that are relevant to unions. When an organization sets up these networks, does it mean that it needs to change its structure? What do we do to try to to protect privacy in the corporate world? Because in these networks, some of these exchanges might concern issues that go beyond professional life. How can we redefine the balance that exists in all businesses between HR, on the one hand, whose business it is to deal with people's careers, and on the other hand, managers and workers? These social networks might redefine the balance between these three. Brian PLATZ will give us his presentation. Please give him a warm welcome.
Find Brian PLATZ on social networks. He's everywhere.
As a co-founder of SILKROAD, a human resources software firm, Brian is passionate about making connections. With Point, Brian and his colleagues have developed a compelling tool to help businesses manage their talent. It's a place for employees to share their views and knowledge. Point tracks everyone's posts and identifies the content that generates the most comments and interest. The goal is to spot which employees have the most influence on a topic, information that HR managers will treasure. Some people aren't so keen on the idea, but Brian's convinced that everyone has something to gain. Businesses learn more about their employees and their skills, and employees take control of their reputation and progress by sharing their knowledge. Measuring everyone's influence. For Brian, it's the way forward.
Well, it's a great honor to be here at UNESCO and to have the recognition that we've had from the Netexplo forum for our product Point. I'm here today to talk about the future of work as we see it. And of course, that future in our minds is very tied to technology. And specifically, we're going to talk a bit about one of our latest projects, latest products, called SILKROAD Point. So a natural way to start out is to sort of ask the basic question. What is the point? Why are we trying to do this? And really the goal is to maximize the talent inside of the organization so that the individuals and the companies themselves are able to achieve the remarkable things that everybody wants, that sort of makes everybody happy. We have this saying, this motto at SILKROAD, work happy. You know, there's sort of two words that really don't go together for a lot of people. And we've looked to attack this problem in the talent management space by having an approach where what we've done is we have separated who our customer is from who our economic buyer is. Our buyer, sort of our direct customer, tends to be human resources, tends to be finance or executives within a company. But we don't necessarily view them as our primary customer. We view our primary customer as the employees within those organizations. And our thought process is that if we can solve the problems of the employees and maximize their performance, ultimately we solve everybody else's problems as well. So we've taken this philosophy and we've applied it to our various products. And you know, while we have many products, we kind of separate them into two main categories. One category being primarily around talent acquisition. It's finding great talent, finding candidates, sourcing candidates, managing them through the recruiting process, and of course getting them onboarded. And sort of the second part of that equation is ongoing talent development. How do we maximize and measure the performance of individuals inside the organization? And we've taken this philosophy, this idea of this employee focus, and we've applied it very, very successfully to the talent acquisition side of this equation. We've had a lot of great success there. But for years, we have tried to apply the same philosophy to the talent development side, to this idea of ongoing performance management. And it's always been very frustrating for us because as much as we try to accomplish this, it's always been a challenge. And what we've ended up realizing through a lot of trial and error is that we're dealing with a process in performance management, the same process that almost every business and corporation out there uses today, that fundamentally has nothing to do with the employee. It's all about the business. So as hard as we try to make that about the employee, eventually we came to a realization that we had to think about the problem fundamentally different. So I think the big question becomes that if this traditional talent performance process doesn't work, then why do we still use it as the predominant way of measuring individuals within business? And some of the answer comes from the fact that at one point it did work. Work used to look a lot different when this process was invented. In fact, work mostly revolved around doing things like making gears, making widgets, making objects. Work was primarily what we call algorithmic style work. There's very specific steps to take that results in a very specific outcome. And it turns out that our performance management process that we use today works pretty well for this type of work. But the world has changed significantly since that type of work was the predominant way of the workforce. And we've entered into the knowledge economy. And this is an area that accelerated tremendously through the 80s and 90s and continues to grow at a rapid pace. In fact, for mature economies today, this represents more than 70% of the workforce. They're no longer performing predominantly algorithmic style work. They're predominantly doing what we call heuristic style work, work that requires thought. There's no defined process. There's no defined outcome. You need to use reason and experience to produce your work result. So while these processes were invented at a time and really solidified in the years kind of after World War II, just as how we do business, the way we work has significantly changed since then. So let's talk a little bit about that kind of traditional process that most of us use. And it looks a little like this. It's this idea of a carrot and stick model. And the story is along the lines of, I'm going to rate you on a scale of 1 to 5, and if you get a 5, I'm going to give you as much money as I can reasonably give you for that performance and that work. And again, it's sort of easy to understand why this took such firm hold in many of our corporations. It's because it's logical. It's easy for us to understand. There's a famous behavioral psychologist, Vic Dulowitz, and he wrote about 20 years ago this observation that humans have a tendency to judge the work of others that they're working with, along with judging one's own work. And it turns out we're a very judgmental species, humans are. So it was very natural for us to take this thing we were already doing, we were already judging people around us, and just write it down. And let's build a process around how we do that. So we ended up with a process that was rooted in a times that really hasn't evolved. There's been some evolution to it, some slight changes, but fundamentally, it's the same as it's always been. And it turns out that this type of process does not work for knowledge workers, for people who need to use thought and perform this more modern heuristic style work. And it's a lot worse than that. It turns out not only does it not promote or increase performance, it actually decreases performance for those type of workers. It actually makes them worse. And it doesn't sound logical. The more money you try to give somebody to increase performance and to do a better job will actually have the opposite effect. It will actually make them perform more poorly. It's a very, very strange concept. And there's many studies that consistently prove this is the case for this style of work, yet it is still what we predominantly use. So I think the next big question becomes, well, why do we still use this? Why is this still the predominant way that we evaluate performance inside of businesses? And that, unfortunately, is a question that I cannot answer. And perhaps this quote sort of circles around one of the problems. We as a species have a very difficult time with change. And as Albert Einstein says here, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking used to actually create them. And I would love to see sort of a show of hands if anyone out there has seen the recent movie last year, Moneyball, or read the book Moneyball. Has anybody seen that out there? All right, several of you. It's a great movie, so I encourage you to see it. It's about baseball. And I'm an American, and typically when we have very difficult problems to solve as Americans and we don't really know a solution, we turn to baseball for answers. It's sort of the way we've done things. And Moneyball is a neat story. It's about the Oakland Athletics, the Oakland A's, about 10 years ago, who were dealing with a problem. Their general manager, a man named Billy Beane, dealing with this issue that he had about 1/3 of the payroll to buy talent that teams like the New York Yankees had, yet he still had to compete with all of these teams effectively. And he knew he couldn't buy the same talent as another team, so he had to take another approach. And he went out and he turned to statistics. And baseball is full, historically, of statistics, but again, the logical ones to people, like how many runs people earn, what the batting percentage is. But what Billy Beane did is he actually started to look at a whole different set of statistics that everyone else was ignoring that actually contributed to wins. And by doing that, he was able to find very undervalued players and assemble a team that ended up producing remarkable results. In fact, that year they broke a record for the number of consecutive wins. They ended up winning their division. And almost more impressively, due to the success of this method, the following year, the Boston Red Sox, hired some talent away. And the Boston Red Sox have had this curse over them for a very long time that many thought they could never win a World Series. A year after adopting this philosophy, the Boston Red Sox won their first World Series in 86 years. And you can imagine this new way of thinking, this Billy Beane, who essentially trusted what was a Harvard economics grad almost right out of college, versus this traditional method of player scouting, this method that had been used 100 years in baseball. And there was a lot of conflict. People tried to get him fired because they thought these ideas were crazy. It would never work. You have to go along with the established method of how do you find the best talent and create a baseball team. And I think we're dealing with a lot of similar problems here today. There's such an establishment of how we evaluate employees and how we do this that even with some evidence that it's not working, it's very, very difficult for us to change. So, how do we change? What works? If this doesn't work, what works? And all the research really around this category circles around kind of three primary things. And those three things, and I'll use Dan Pink in his book Drive, the way he refers to them. It's autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And when those three things come together, that is what maximizes performance in knowledge workers. And let's talk briefly about each one. Autonomy, and autonomy shouldn't be confused with independence. It doesn't mean working alone. What it means is having the freedom to solve the problems in the way you want to solve them, not having it dictated to you. Solving problems based on the process you want to follow, with the people you want to solve them with, and in the time frame you want to do that with. And there's a really interesting study I'll quote here done by Cornell University. They looked at 320 small businesses. Half of those, 160, used a framework of autonomy to run their business. The other half used the very traditional top-down leadership style. And the results between these two groups is astounding. The groups that leveraged autonomy performed 4 times better than the group of companies that use the traditional top-down management style. And they had 1/3 of the employee turnover. It's not just a little difference, it's a big, big difference. Mastery. Mastery is this sort of basic human desire to get better at things. It gives us pleasure, and if people aren't even doing this at work, they're usually doing this on their own times. They're learning to play instruments, they're learning how to cook. It's sort of a basic thing. Anyone with kids realizes that, when kids come out, they want to get better. They have this sort of self-direction thing. It's tapping into sort of that basic human principle. And it's actually been shown scientifically that as you get better at things, it institutes pleasure. It institutes sort of the same parts of your brain and activates the same parts of your brain as other pleasurable type of activities. So if we can harness and leverage this, it can have very great effects on creativity. And lastly, purpose. Purpose has become really good business in general for companies of all sizes. Because not only, as we're discussing here, does having purpose and having an employee base that believes in that purpose allow them to perform better, it turns out having a solid purpose is being considered favorable now by more and more consumers. You'll sell more by having a solid purpose. And it's becoming increasingly critical for talent acquisition. The new generation of the workforce, the millennials, the thing that they rate is the most important factor of choosing a job today is what they refer to as meaning or purpose. It's more important to them than pay. It's more important to them than benefits. and it's more important to them than even work-life balance. It's the #1 most critical factor for these new graduates coming into the workforce. So we see a lot of companies adopting these principles for that specific reason. So how do we take together now all of these sort of ideas and mash it with the latest and greatest technology? And that's really where we come in with our solution, SILKROAD POINT. And I'll show you a little bit of what it does and how it works. What we see here is the homepage of Point, where you first log in. And Point does many things. It's part social networking, it's part collaboration tool, it's part a knowledge management tool. We'll specifically focus here more on the controversial aspect, or what we consider the more exciting aspect, which is this notion of understanding and inferring influence about individuals. And we're logged in here as Michael, and what Michael sees on his homepage is the ability to access all kinds of different capabilities related to finding people or learning what other people are doing. But I'll specifically direct you to the circle there where we're highlighting influence. Similar to sort of a stock ticker, what we're highlighting here for Michael is his top influence moves around some of his specific skills. And if Michael were to click on that influence bubble, we take him to what we call his influence diagram. And surrounding Michael here are individual skills that he has listed as part of his profile. Again, we sort of bring this back to this notion of autonomy. Michael's in control of what skills he wants to appear there. So the size of the circle around each of these skills represents the amount of relative influence that Michael has in each of those topics. Now, when we start mapping out information and inferring influence, we can start to do a lot of other interesting things as well. To the right, in the blue, you see some of these blue dots, and that's actually being mapped as the people that Michael is influencing the most. See, we start to understand exactly how knowledge and expertise flows inside of corporations. And right below that, we're actually able to point out the most influential content that Michael has put out and published. So if Michael has an interest in learning a bit more about one of these individual skills, he could simply click on one, and in this case, if he clicked on the one labeled graphical user interface there, what he's presented is, again, very much like sort of a stock ticker, his history of performance or influence around that particular skill. But we also give him a couple other pieces of information. We give them, what we see here in green is the top influencer in the company around this skill. Where do they fall? So we're giving him sort of a line of sight into, if he wants to become the most influential person in the company around this topic, that may be a goal. Again, we're playing to this sort of natural human behavior, a mastery. We're counting on him wanting that to be a goal. He has some visibility as to where he stands. And also here in blue, we're highlighting for everyone else in the company that does have this skill, where they average. So he gets some insight into that. And if he wants to understand why he ranks, where he ranks, how we're determining his influence around this skill, by clicking on sort of any of these dots, we will give him the information that is contributing most heavily to his influence. We calculate influence based on a large number of factors, and it's something we're always looking to tweak and refine, just like Google is always tweaking and refining their search algorithms to produce better search results. But a large number of factors contribute, and in this case, we're highlighting certain pieces of content that Michael's authored that must be influential. People must have indicated they rely on that content. It was quite good. We're also indicating here certain questions that Michael might have answered. And we're also showing Michael different people or individuals who rely on him for that particular skill. So the product obviously does a lot more. This kind of highlights one area, and we've really only looked at it from the employee perspective. I think the exciting start piece is the other side of this, as well as the data and information we can get back to human resources, who can then use this knowledge to hire better people, understand the true skills being relied on in a position, understand critical talent risks inside the company, redo how they approach succession planning. It has an opportunity to change not just a couple things, but when you have information like this, it really has a chance to change how you do all of those core practices within the business. And I'll conclude so we can leave a little bit of time for questions. And I'll just say here that we really view this as a very, very exciting time in business. We're kind of dealing with these processes and a mentality that originated in a time that we have gradually moved away from. And it's sort of like we have this rubber band that's been stretching and stretching and stretching. We're still trying to use this old process to sort of the new way of work, and we think it's getting very close to being about to just snap. And we think it's going to be a really exciting time in business and certainly a really great opportunity for us in what we're trying to achieve.
Oui, okay. So I said we have a lot of questions. You already answered to some of them. Let's say we have the technical questions, and I propose to the people interested in to contact you directly on what are exactly the influence model and some other things like that. You have other type of question which are kind of credibility question. Are you sure that it works? Are you sure that somebody could not bypass the tool to be in the first front and to be the one, the good one, despite the fact that perhaps he's not doing a lot of things behind what he declares or what he is doing? And the third type of question are more or less related to the consequence or the adaptation of the organization around that. What does this mean exactly? Could you just give us...
Sure. So are we confident it works? Well, this is really a tool put in place more around this idea of knowledge workers. So you have to put it into context. Is it going to work for sort of this traditional algorithmic style worker that we talked about before? And perhaps they're not. But for knowledge workers, we really believe it's the first system that embraces the concepts that maximize performance for that type of worker. And for us, it's a matter of, at this point, just really honing how we calculate things like influence. And a lot of it isn't about necessarily coming up with a very direct answer as to, I have a very specific score. We're more interested in looking at trends. So when you look at trends, you can sort of potentially game a system, but you can game it just once, right? And then you need to keep up sort of that trend. And people around you, it's a very, the internet as a whole and a lot of these systems, there's always skepticism as far as abuse happening. And it's a very controlled system. People keep it working, people keep other people honest. So the ones that are performing this type of activity probably are not that difficult to find out. There's probably other issues with those individuals.
Okay. Do we have another little bit of time? No? Thierry? Just one. Okay, so just one question. So let's say a simple one. Are you present in France? And how many of the Fortune 500 companies are using your tools?
Yeah, so we do have a presence in France, in Paris here. And we have slightly over 60 of the Fortune 500 that currently use our tools. Our focus tends to be more on mid-market companies, but we do have companies of all sizes, of all industries, that leverage our tools today.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Thank you.